the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Spirituality is a cop-out, so declared the Bishop of Southwark from his pulpit on the first Saturday of the new millennium, alienating at a stroke a cathedral full of people who'd gathered for a conference on the very subject he'd dismissed. Tom Butler is a Yorkshireman, proud of his down-to-earth common sense, and he reckoned he had good reasons for that position. After all, Jesus does seem to have been a practical man. He drew a lot of his teaching from agriculture, business, domestic life. He visited people in their homes, was happy to eat and drink, and when he quoted scripture, it was for a purpose. If he encountered people who were sick, he restored them to health. No sermons about the nobility of suffering. He told his disciples to become fishers of men. He called himself a shepherd. He was firmly in this world. And yet, constantly he would go apart from his disciples to pray, to talk to his Father. Maybe he was simply asking for guidance on what he should do next, but talking to God is not like talking to your stockbroker. And he constantly quoted Isaiah, Moses, and all the prophets. The Psalms of David were perpetually on his lips. These too were intensely practical men, but they too were explicitly reliant on the deity. All the prophets, men of the world who advised kings on politics or warfare, each of them had had a mystical experience, was aware of the world beyond ours, had had life-changing experiences that set afire in the very core of their being. How would they respond to the good Bishop Butler? Would they have said spirituality was a cop-out? Let's pick up this morning's Gospel passage. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. I am giving you these commands so that you may love one another. I remember when I was a child, this kind of talk made me very queasy. It was the kind of thing the girls learned in Sunday school, while the boys took hard knocks in the rough and tumble of the choir. It sounded emotional, not just to do with relationships, but a matter of relationships with people you usually tried to avoid. Why would anybody want to love anyone other than your family? Well, if you want to pursue that, you should read C.S. Lewis's book, The Four Loves. He sets it all out in detail, and you'll never need to think about it again. But the point is, of course, that loving your neighbour, which Christ talks about, is not to do with emotions. It's to do with valuing people, respecting them, being patient with them. All the things St. Paul talks about in his letter to the Corinthians when he describes love without ever quite defining it. It's a practical thing. It's to do with how you treat people in the world, how you prioritise what you're going to do for people and with people. So if it's not emotional, is it spiritual? Are we talking matters of the spirit rather than affairs of the heart? Again, spiritual love can sound creepy. It can speak of frustration, shame possibly about more earthly feelings, longing for what's denied to you. Spirituality can be slippery. It can be a refuge from too much reality. Maybe it can be a cop-out. We don't need to go so far. Come back to the more down-to-earth teachings of Jesus. Yes, he did speak about fig trees and vines, sowers of seed and sheep with one flock, one shepherd. But he wasn't, and we all know this, he wasn't actually telling us about sheep or figs. It was about God's kingdom, so it all actually was spiritual. He didn't approach spiritual things head on. But also, and we need to pay attention to this also, he gave advice like going the extra mile, turning the other cheek, not carrying two tunics, avoiding litigation. Is this spiritual or practical? I suggest we don't actually have to answer that question. Maybe spiritual and practical aren't so far apart after all. Turning the other cheek, forgiving your enemies, foregoing revenge. Is that piety, or is it a strategy for keeping people on side, not getting beaten up? Maybe non-aggression diffuses situations, gets people's attention, makes them think perhaps there's something in this Christianity after all, and beginning to come to church. And so, to come back to love, as the Gospels have been telling us over the past few weeks, what is required from us is good fruit, plentiful fruit that will last. And as I've been stressing also, it's required of us as a people. It's required of us as a people, as a group, as a church, not as individuals. And no body of people is going to be able to do that if they're at odds with each other. Imagine a choir where no one wants to follow the notes. A soccer team where half of them want to play rugger. Cricketers who prefer to follow the rules of baseball. Imagine going for a job interview with Microsoft and admitting at your interview that actually you were an Apple person, and you would be advising your clients that possibly they should be looking at Apple products as well as Microsoft ones. Just imagine your chance of getting a job there. If rules aren't followed, if foundation documents, if policies aren't obeyed, the result is chaos. And that's one way of looking at love, the kind of love Christ enjoined on us. Something binding people together, something that they enter into voluntarily, that gives them common mind, common purpose, enables them to be productive in the way required of them, but also transforms the world by showing people how life can be lived. People say you can't compel yourself to love. Well, that wasn't what was asked of us. What asked is that we should love Christ, that we should love God. That's like loving Microsoft. It is the common love that binds you together, not the feeling that you need to be concentrating on fellow individuals. This is a theme we'll be continuing and coming back to week after week. But there's one thing I do want to talk a little about. Spirituality is a cop-out, the good bishop said. And of course he was teasing. Spirituality can be immensely practical. But it's not just that. As I said, Christ and the prophets were intensely spiritual people. It was in their conscious engagement with the God in the depths of their being. It was in their encounters with holiness that their life in the world was rooted. We are people of spirit, just as much as we're physical and emotional. We are creatures of eternity and infinity as much as we are fixed in time and space. You don't have to take it from me. You can try meditation or mindfulness, which will make all that suddenly seem very real to you. You can read accounts of holy lives, some of which admittedly will appall you, but others will ring a bell, make you see a place you could come home to. You can become aware of it in worship. Usually, admittedly, worship that lasts longer than ours, less talking, more acknowledgement of mystery, and that can bring a sense of profound contentment that you won't find elsewhere. I wonder if you find that kind of thing attractive, or whether it makes you wriggle in your seat. Well, the good news is none of it's compulsory. Christ's yoke was easy, his burden light. If he comes to visit you, he may bring a bottle of wine rather than the prayer mat and some incense sticks. In the end, though, it doesn't matter so much one way or the other. There isn't so much urgency. God may require no more of you than he asks from the lobelia in your border or the blue tit on your bed table. The only cop-out is to become deaf to him. The only cop-out is to become deaf to God. How does that happen? Well, we read the gospel in church every Sunday. We read it not just because it says we must, but because there will be some word there that is going to speak to you. Some word that God has targeted for you, possibly for you alone. Did you make a note of it?